Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to a very special Conservation Happy Hour. I am Emily Ringer. I'm the Communications and Marketing Manager at Polar Bears International. And I want to begin by thanking you so much for tuning in for this exciting collaboration and this really important conversation today. Now, this is our first event in another series of Conservation Happy Hours. And as always, we hope that you leave these events feeling more connected to the work you support and to polar bears and to the Arctic at large. So today you'll be learning from and hearing from a very exciting suite of people. Firstly, our Chief Scientist, Dr. Stephen Amstrup, our Director of Conservation Outreach and also a staff scientist, Alysa McCall, and world-renowned environmental writer and commentator and a dear, dear friend of PBI, Kieran Mulvaney. So given the importance of this conversation and this topic, we are going to structure this a little bit differently than we have in the past. And we are going to allow the presentation portion of this to be a live event. So in a few moments, or live beyond this, so on our website, we'll be streaming it. So in a few moments, we are going to push the conversation between these three live, and they'll have their conversation, they'll give their presentation, and at the end of that, we will cut the live stream, and that will open up a space back in this private webinar for you to ask your questions. Which leads me to, well, and actually quick note, please know that it will take us a moment to cut the live stream. So hang tight, know that we will have that private Q&A space in just a couple of moments. And questions, we want you to be able to ask them. We want to give you access to these experts and for you to be able to engage. And so for today's event, we ask that you use the Q&A feature on Zoom. So if you look at your Zoom window, on the bottom of your screen, you'll likely see a couple of icons. And if you see two overlapping dialog boxes, that is the Q&A feature. So you can click on that and type and submit your question there. And that's where we will log your questions and feed them to the panelists and get them answered. And then for anything else a little bit more casual, if you would just like to say hello, I see that the chat actually already has a ton of activity, so I don't really need to explain it. But if you would like to let us know where you're watching from or engage with our panelists for any other reason, please use the chat. And with that, we are going to pause for a moment. You'll see KT Miller also on right now. She is going to push this stream live. And then, as I mentioned, at the end, we will come back to this private viewing space and have a nice intimate chat to answer your questions. Thanks.
All right, thanks everyone. Just hang with us for one moment here. And we are live. And we'll pass it back to you, Em.
Okay, so I'm going to almost immediately pass the mic to Kieran Mulvaney, who will be facilitating this discussion between Dr. Stephen Amstrup and Alysa McCall. So we will turn the video and the microphones over to them.
Unmute my, we are all good. All right. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening. And if you're joining us from Australia, good morning. Welcome to a very special Polar Bears International Conservation Happy Hour. Over the next 30 or 40 minutes or so, we're going to talk about polar bears, of course, about sea ice, and about climate change and the impact of climate change on polar bears and sea ice. And we'll also be talking about some of the remedial actions that we can take as individuals, as communities, as a global society, to try to limit the impact of climate change on polar bears. My name is Kieran Mulvaney. I'm a freelance writer. I'm the author of The Great White Bear, A Natural and Unnatural History of the Polar Bear. Most importantly, I consider myself a good friend of the team at Polar Bears International, and we will be talking talking with two members of that team over the next 30 or 40 minutes. Shortly, we will be hearing from Alysa McCall. She is the Director of Conservation Outreach and a staff scientist for PBI. But let's begin, shall we, with a man who could be described as the grey eminence of polar bear research and conservation. He is the Chief Scientist for PBI, a man with many, many years of expertise in the field, Dr. Stephen Amstrup. Steve, thank you very much for joining us.
Well, and thank you for that flattering introduction. I'm not sure how to take that.
Some of the people who are listening in will have had the opportunity to have been in Churchill, to have spent time with PBI, to have met you and talked to you, but quite a few other people here also won't. We are going to talk about some of the new research that you've been an important part of. But first of all, before we do that, I wonder if, especially for those who are new, you could give us a little bit of a sense of your background, how you got into polar bear research and conservation. And one of the things that I think I'm very interested in is how your work now differs from how it was when you began.
Yeah, well, I was asked by the director of the Denver Wildlife Research Center back in 1979 if I would be interested in going to Alaska and getting a polar bear research program going. They'd been kind of struggling with getting a project going in Alaska for some time, and I felt pretty honored to have the opportunity to go up and try and make it actually happen. In those early years, our main concerns were, one, how to study polar bears. I mean, that was in the early days, very formative years of polar bear research, and we knew things about polar bears, but we were also spending a lot of time learning how to learn about polar bears. And so it was a really exciting time, a lot of time out on the sea ice. I was out on the ice about 8 weeks every spring and about 6 weeks every fall, catching bears, looking at the habitat and things like that. And so it was quite interesting. And it also gave me an early glimpse into the changes that I was going to see during the 30 years that I was in charge of research in Alaska. When I first went to Alaska in the early 1980s, I could stand on the beach in Barrow or Prudhoe Bay in the summertime and look out and see the sea ice. It was literally right there. If I had binoculars, I might be able to see a polar bear out there hunting for seals. During the latter years and currently, if you stand on the beach in Barrow in the late summer, when the sea ice is at its minimum, the ice is hundreds of miles offshore. It's beyond the curvature of the Earth, so it doesn't matter how powerful a telescope you have, you couldn't see it. And that's really important for polar bears, because not only do polar bears, as our studies have shown over the years, depend on the sea ice for catching their prey. In Alaska, they depend on a very narrow band of sea ice that's adjacent to shore. And in the summertime now, that band is gone. So I saw tremendous changes in habitat, and I was there during a time when my early publications showed the population recovering from excessive harvest that occurred in the 50s and 60s. And then in the latter part of my career, I was responsible for advising the Secretary of Interior on the threats that climate change posed. And from that, we actually got polar bears listed as a threatened species under the ESA.
And it was really in that latter role that you were involved in some of the really most important recent research on polar bears and the impact. You began to quantify some of the potential impacts of climate change on polar bear populations, right? It was, I think, 2007, you published a really seminal study that looked at the situation and concluded that we could lose 2/3 of polar bear populations by mid-century if we didn't act. And then a couple of years later, you followed that up with, hey, wait a minute, we don't have to not act, we can act. What happens if we reduce greenhouse gas emissions by this much, How does that affect sea ice and polar bears? Can you talk a little bit about those two studies?
Yeah, we, in 2007, the work that my team and I did was to inform the Secretary of Interior about whether or not to list polar bears as a threatened species. At that same time, there were several publications that came out in scientific literature questioning whether the sea ice in the Arctic may already have passed a tipping point. That is, that we were already at a warm enough temperature on Earth that the sea ice was going to collapse unreversibly, unstoppably, regardless of what we did. And I felt that that was really an important question to address, because if that was the case, why bother to do anything about saving polar bears, you know? And so I put together another team, and in 2010, we published a paper that basically reiterated the prediction that we could lose 2/3 of the world's polar bears by the middle of the century on the greenhouse gas trajectory that we were on. But we also showed that there's a linear but inverse relationship between global mean temperature and sea ice extent, and not a nonlinear relationship that might cause the kind of a crash or tipping point that had been written about by some authors. So what that paper showed very importantly was that if we stop the rise in greenhouse gas concentrations, we can actually save the ice on which polar bears depend.
One of the things also that your work showed at that time, which I think is very important as a way of understanding how polar bears live on sea ice and how the environment affects them and how we can affect that sea ice, is I think it's probably very easy for some of us to assume, well, there's sea ice and there's not sea ice. Polar bears are either on ice or they're on land, and that's all there is to it. But not all sea ice is the same. Not all polar bear habitat is exactly the same, is it? You were able to find that there were a number of very distinct types of sea ice habitat that polar bears occupy.
Yeah, that's right. And that topic actually came up when I was struggling with how do I interpret the information that we had about polar bears to the Secretary of Interior when we had 19 designated polar bear subpopulations. How could I get the Secretary to grasp the concept of 19 different subpopulations? But in looking at how the sea ice moves and differences in different regions of the Arctic, I came to the conclusion that there were 4 major ecoregions, each ecoregion composed of several of these subpopulations. But these ecoregions each share more similarities than differences in terms of their sea ice and in terms of how polar bears respond to it. The one that we probably know the most about is the one shown here in green. This is the seasonal ice ecoregion. And there, as like Hudson Bay is the graphic example of that, probably the most well-known example, where sea ice melts entirely in the summertime. It's only annual ice. And so for as long as humans have been around to observe polar bears, that has been an annual ice environment. And that means that every summer, polar bears have had to come ashore for an extended period of time. In contrast to that, the rest of the Arctic, polar bears in those days could stay on the sea ice year round. Just north of that seasonal ice environment is that pale orange environment that is the inter-island channels of the Canadian archipelago. And up until very recently, these channels were choked with solid ice pretty much all year round. And north of that and around Greenland is the blue area. That's what I call the convergent ice ecoregion. And that convergent ice region also is one where polar bears historically had ice year round. They didn't have to come ashore for when the ice melted, because it didn't melt. But that blue area, the convergent area, gets its ice, or a big part of it, from that purple area, which is I call the divergent ice area. That includes northern Alaska and all the way around northern Russia to the Barents Sea, around Svalbard. And in that purple area, the ice is constantly forming, but being moved out into the polar basin or out of the polar basin through Fram Strait. And much of it piles up on that northern Greenland and northern part of the Canadian archipelago. So there's 4 distinct areas, but one commonality for polar bears in all of them is that they all depend on catching their prey from the sea ice.
So bit by bit, you're piecing together all this available information. We're finding out what we can about polar bears and sea ice. Then, as you point out, you're able to identify the various different regions that will be impacted in different ways. Let's fast forward then a number of years. People who are on this chat who have spent time in Churchill will know what it's like to be bouncing around on the buggy out in the tundra, and maybe you don't see any polar bears for a while. And so you get talking, and obviously if you're fortunate enough to have somebody like yourself on the buggy, you get to learn a great deal of stuff. I think being on buggy one and listening to you scientists go back and forth is the best way to to learn. And as I understand it, you were involved in a couple of those conversations out on Buggy One in Churchill, and that prompted this new research that we're talking about. You guys got together, brainstormed. Tell me a little bit about who you were talking to out on Buggy One and how these ideas came together for this brand new research.
So a little bit of background on that. In the late part of the first decade of the 2000s, we had determined that probably the most critical parameter that polar bears face is how many ice-free days occur every summer, because they can catch their prey on the ice, but when the ice is gone, they're forced onto land or out onto deep water over the deep water polar basin where there's very little food. In either case, they're food deprived. So how many ice-free days in the important habitat was really an important variable, but we didn't really know very well how to handle that. A colleague of mine, Peter Molnar, had done some preliminary work about that same time frame, looking at energetics and trying to calculate how long a polar bear can actually go without food. But that was fairly limited work. And the other thing that was really limited was we didn't have good estimates of how many ice-free days we would have in the future, because at that time, climate models were really limited to predicting ice-free months. And to get how many days a bear might be faced with a situation where they couldn't hunt, you had to do some interpolation, and it was not very accurate. Well, I was out on the tundra buggy with Marika Holland, one of the premier sea ice scientists from the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And she just happened to mention that, oh, their new models had multiple realizations that produced numbers of ice-free days directly. And I thought, And so we had a great discussion. I asked her if she would be interested in helping with a project to evaluate this ability of polar bears to fast more broadly. And she said she would. When I got back into town, I called Peter on the phone and I said, hey, would you be interested in pursuing the work that you started a few years ago and joining it with this new work that Marika and others have done? And we ended up putting together a team that included Cecilia Biss from the University of Washington, Marika, Peter, one of Peter's PhD students, and Jennifer Kay, who is also a prominent sea ice scientist. And that was the team that put together this new paper that just came out this summer.
We are going to talk a little bit about some of the findings from that paper, but we do also have a video that the team at PBI put together, and that summarizes it quite well. So I think we're going to take a quick look at that video first of all.
Polar bears live throughout the Arctic, where they make a living by hunting seals on the surface of the sea ice. But not all sea ice is equal. Some sea ice lies over biologically rich waters with lots of seals. Other sea ice lies over deep, unproductive waters. Some sea ice melts each summer, while other areas of the Arctic Ocean are covered with sea ice year-round. Because the polar bear's sea ice habitat literally melts as temperatures rise, human-caused global warming means polar bears have less and less sea ice to hunt on in the summer months. Studies show that some polar bear populations are already declining due to longer fasting periods. However, in other more northerly areas where there's more sea ice or in areas with lots of seals, polar bears may not be impacted yet. Ultimately, all polar bears will be affected as global warming continues. In 2010, Dr. Amstrup led a study showing that unless we greatly reduce carbon emissions, 2/3 of the world's polar bears could disappear by the end of the century. This was a monumental warning. But it left a new, big, unanswered question. Exactly when? When will polar bears begin to disappear in different parts of the Arctic? Now, through the efforts of a team of sea ice scientists and ecological modelers brought together by Dr. Amstrup, we finally have some more details to answer that question. In this new study, data from polar bears fasting on land was used to determine how many days polar bears can go without sea ice before reproduction and survival decline rapidly. These estimates were intersected with climate model projections of how many ice-free days polar bears will face in different places around the Arctic. To make these models, the amount of sea ice was derived from 2 greenhouse gas emissions scenarios. The first scenario models what will happen to polar bears if people take no action on climate change and continue to maximize use of fossil fuels with business as usual carbon emissions. In this scenario, the average end-of-century temperature is 4.3 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. This would mean that a few populations of polar bears may survive in the most northern parts of their current range, but most would collapse by the end of the century. That's only 80 years from now, a human lifetime. The second scenario models what will happen if people make moderate reductions to carbon emissions, with an average end-of-century temperature increase of 2.4 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. In this case, more polar bear populations may persist to the latter part of this century. Although this scenario is better in the short term, the long-term temperatures would still continue to rise beyond 2100, exceeding the warmest periods that have occurred during the polar bear's evolutionary history. And their long-term future would still not be assured. Ideally, we would follow a different scenario, one not modeled here, where people come together and take swift, bold action as a global community to meet the goals set during the Paris Agreement and keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees. This is still an option. There is still time to act. Doing so could preserve polar bears over much of their current range indefinitely. Polar bears show us the consequences that a warming world brings, both for the Arctic and for the rest of the planet. The future of polar bears is interconnected with our own. We can choose to rapidly decrease our reliance on fossil fuels and make a swift transition to renewable energy. Doing so would not only protect polar bears, but ecosystems and species around the world, including us.
So, Steve, being able to sort of drill down in that kind of detail, I mean, it's sort of like the holy grail, really, of this kind of research, to be able to look at the number of ice-free days rather than months. And I'm curious, I was very excited when I found out that the study was ongoing. I'm very curious what the reaction has been to it since it was published.
We've had an amazing response to this paper, and I'm very grateful for that because I viewed this as probably the most important contribution of my scientific career. But when this paper was released, the Nature journals did a review, and I guess they do a review of the press that's garnered by all of the articles that appear. And ours was one of the most well-covered articles ever. It was in the 99th percentile for this summer. And, you know, over the last couple of years, it compared favorably to the coverage that, you know, gravitational waves and things like that we're getting. So I felt very good about the amount of attention that this paper has gotten. And I'm looking forward to that attention that reached the public actually being transferred to managers and policymakers.
What do you put that sort of response down to? Do you think it's the fact that you had this ability to really quantify something for the first time, or does it really reflect the affection that people have for polar bears, the interest that people have in polar bears, the fact that they are these beacons of climate change, that in a sense if we can understand what's happening with polar bears, we can sort of understand what's happening with everything else?
Well, I think that the fact that polar bears have captured the human imagination going back many centuries was part of this. Anything new that comes out about polar bears typically gets a fair amount of attention. I think the extra attention that this paper got was because we really took that next step of not only being able to tell policymakers that polar bears are in trouble unless we change our ways, that they can now look at different parts of the Arctic. They can say, oh, Well, now I see when the polar bears in the region that I'm responsible for are going to be impacted. And, you know, it's sort of the typical politician thing that many of them aren't willing to respond until the gun is to their head. And this paper shows when that gun will be to their head.
Right. You mentioned there, you know, the importance of managers understanding when they have to act. As Katie mentioned in the narration of that video, the one scenario that you didn't address in the paper was a third scenario in which we take major efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And that's really the scenario at the end of the day that we have no choice but to follow, isn't it?
That's right. And when we started this project, we did not have access to the climate change models based on the 2-degree or less temperature rise. That was what people agreed in Paris in 2015 should be the world's objective. The modeling just hadn't been done there. And part of the reason it hadn't been done is because I think a lot of the climate modeling at that time suggested that, well, we're not going to see that really. So let's produce models that show us something in the range that we might be likely to see. However, we need to emphasize it is entirely possible to get on that Paris path, even now. And if we do, we can hold temperatures at a level that will preserve enough sea ice that polar bears will probably hang on over much of their current range. So I think that's a really exciting prospect. And I wish we had the opportunity to include that in the paper, but maybe that's another paper.
There you go. This seems like a good point to bring in the third member of our discussion here, Alysa McCall. Alysa is the Director of Conservation Outreach for PBI and staff scientist. There she is, joining us all the way from the Yukon. Alysa, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Kieran.
So, Alysa, when we're talking with Steve earlier about how he got involved in polar bear research and really how his work has changed so very much over the years. In contrast, really, your career has always been in an environment in which we were fully aware of the impact of climate change on polar bears and sea ice. And I wonder if you could give us a little bit of a background about your work.
Absolutely. I came into polar bear research at a really interesting time. It's been 10 years this year, so I've been doing this for a decade now. And I became a polar bear biologist when the other polar bear biologists all understood what was threatening polar bears, what was at stake, and what would happen down the road if we didn't act now. But we did not yet have effective communication tools to bring this to the public in a way that really would inspire change. So I would find myself, telling people about the problem and polar bears and what's happening to them. And it was great if they already cared about polar bears and kind of understood climate change, that was no problem. But it became an issue where I had to convince someone that climate change was real or convince them to care about polar bears. I did not have the effective tools to use to help them understand what was going on. So I could not bring them over to our side, but I was not meeting them where they were. And so that's really become a big part of my job and a big part of what Polar Bears International is doing, is more effectively bridging this gap between what the scientists are doing and what the public understands or what they want to hear. And we really started to see people don't want any more images of the lone starving polar bear floating off on an iceberg into the ocean. What people want and what actually inspires action is clear, explanatory chains, helping people understand what is happening to polar bears and why. Giving them tangible actions that really will help polar bears and sea ice and themselves, and then explaining realistic outcomes, which is such a huge part of what Steve's doing here. People really want to know the truth, and they want to feel like they're empowered to take action and do something about that. So this has really spurred Polar Bears International to work with more social scientists. And it's been a really key part of what we've been doing in the last few years. We are now weaving social science into basically all of our communications, whether it's online and other talks or written on social media. And it turns out that starting with shared values is the way to go. And for the most part, no matter where people are coming from in their background or their geography or their education level, almost everyone agrees that we should protect our future for future generations. We should protect what we have, whether it's polar bears or forests. We need to protect what humans have. And so we really are starting from that baseline. Climate warming is changing how we do conservation, especially in terms of sea ice. You know, we can't put a fence around sea ice. We can't hire people to protect it and not let others in. That doesn't do anything. This really is a global issue that we need to work on together. And humans have tackled pretty huge issues in the past using innovation and creativity. And this is another one of those issues that we can work together on. But the good thing is that we do know what we need to do. We have the solutions already. We just need more action to push those forward.
Yeah, and isn't one of the difficulties, of course, like people want to feel empowered, but it's such an enormous issue, isn't it? Isn't that one of the things that's difficult to get people engaged? It must seem so helpless, like what on earth can I possibly do? And there's that interesting dichotomy, isn't it? On the one hand, yes, we want people to be able to take individual action and feel involved too, but it's also a much bigger issue. In a sense, we need people to not only become involved themselves, but to involve other people, to involve communities, and we ultimately really need a much larger, almost top-down solution. Isn't that fair to say?
Absolutely, and that's really where we've come to in the last couple of years as well. We are moving away from this individual action mindset over to a community action mindset. It's no longer if everyone recycles and uses LED light bulbs, the world will be saved. It's really, we need to use our voices and push our policy leaders to make strong systemic change to how we use our energy. And also just to reduce some of this anxiety. When we speak to all sorts of audience, from kindergartners to audiences like the ones we have today, and we want people to leave those talks feeling empowered. And it's very hard to do that if they feel like all the pressure is on themselves. This is not a one-person job to fix. It's really a community problem to fix them, but we can get together, and we're already seeing these things happen. It's so fantastic to see this change happening, but we need more. So we do need top-down leadership. We need strong policy changes. We need to empower people and give them the tools that they need to make changes in their own communities together.
And Steve, even though this may seem, you know, to some people just like an enormous problem, one that's incredibly difficult to address, we have some precedents, right? Sometimes you might get people who will say, oh, you people are going on about climate change. Remember when you used to go on about the hole in the ozone layer? How come you don't talk about that anymore? Well, that's because we fixed it. So it can be done, right? With the necessary political will, it can be done.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the Montreal Protocol was a great example of the world coming together, the policy leaders from most of the governments in the world coming together to agree we need to do something to stop the emissions of gases that are reducing the ozone. And in fact, we did that. And the ozone is on the way, the ozone hole is on the way to being healed. On a smaller scale, the US and Canada fixed acid rain. That was a result of emissions from smokestacks in the eastern part, the northeastern part of the US and southeastern part of Canada. And so, you know we can do things like that. Another one is the second millennium issue with computers. You know, that we all thought the computers of the world were going to crash and we were going to be in the dark until people fixed it. Well, a lot of people got together and fixed it before it happened. But recognizing that it could be a problem was the force that drove them to doing that. And so, you know, we do have precedents. This is perhaps the biggest challenge. It differs from the others in that we really need to change how we generate and use power. And that's something that we have taken for granted, relying on cheap fossil fuels for a long, long time. And so disentangling us from that is a more difficult challenge. But answers, as Alysa said a little while ago, answers are out there. We know what to do. We just need that policy level leadership to push us forward. And, you know, if you look back at the history of Western civilizations, almost all of the major things that we depend on now, our infrastructure, telephones, electricity, what have you, all of those were really pushed in the early stages by governments saying, hey, this is how we can better the lives of our citizens. And we are at that stage now where we really need that leadership.
Alysa, I'm wondering, we sort of need to wrap this up, but I wonder, as a sort of go home message for people, do you find, to follow on from what Steve just said, that a very effective message, that if you are able to say to people, if you take it away from being people wondering about, oh, what are we going to have to give up to stop climate change? Oh, you know, it's going to be so miserable. Instead, having them focus on, hey, here's the new technology that we have at our disposal. Here's the great new clean energy systems that we have that is going to make life better for us all. If you focus on that kind of positive solution, do you find that to be a very effective message?
Oh, absolutely. I think that's the way to go. If you think about a future with all renewable energies, the air is cleaner, the sea ice is there, humans are healthier, happier, and our wildlife is too. And that's what's going to drive people, the carrot, not the stick. And so that's really what Polar Bears International is focusing on too, these positive solutions moving forward.
So that's a great positive message. And let's finish on a couple of positive images here. We're talking about climate change, but we're all here because of polar bears, let's be honest. And you two, between you, have seen far more polar bears than most people on the planet. And I'm curious as to what goes through your mind every time you see a polar bear, what you thought the first time you saw a polar bear in the wild, and do you still get that same kind of sensation now, 10 years later, in your case, Alysa, from first becoming a polar bear researcher, that you got back then?
Absolutely. If anything, my awe for them has grown, which I didn't think was possible. It's been almost exactly 10 years since I saw my first polar bear, and I was just amazed at the time. And if anything, the more I learn about them, the more I see them, the more I know about what they're going through, my respect for them runs deeper and deeper every single year. And I always feel so fortunate to see any polar bear that I can see. They're an incredible animal, and we want to keep them in the Arctic as long as possible.
And Steve, the same question to you, and the final word to you. You've seen many polar bears over the years. I wonder if you can give us your impressions of having been up close with this species for so long.
Yeah, I was doing field research in Alaska for 30 years, and the very first bear I saw, I'll never forget it. We were about 40 miles offshore in the sea ice, in this just jumble of cracked ice with big blocks in it and a few open leads here and there. And I was going through my mind was, how could anything live out here? And then suddenly here was this giant white bear in front of us. And it was just like, holy cow, there's a real wild polar bear. And every bear since then, and I've probably caught a couple thousand, every bear since then has been the same kind of a holy cow experience. I mean, these are just such incredible creatures, and I am personally invested in trying to keep them around.
Fantastic. And I know that everybody else who's listening and watching feels the same way about polar bears. I hope we've been able to give everybody some useful and helpful information, and also to inspire everyone who's watching to take action in order to protect polar bears and their Arctic environment. Steve, Alysa, thank you very, very much indeed. Everybody out there, please do continue to pay attention to Polar Bears International social media platforms. It's Polar Bear Week next week. There'll be lots of video, there'll be lots of actions, there'll be lots of opportunities to learn more about polar bears. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Stephen Amstrup. Thank you, Alysa McCall. For Polar Bears International, I am Kieran Mulvaney. Thanks for joining us.
And the live stream is stopped. Thanks everyone for letting us share that with the world. And I'm gonna pass it back to Emily.
There we go, I was muted. Yes, and I'm just going to immediately pass it back to Kieran. We are filtering, we've seen some nice questions come in through the Q&A, so feel free if you still have a lingering question. There's no question too small, too silly, no stupid questions. We're all here to learn and to take care of polar bears in their future. So I will start passing those questions to Kieran. I think you have your first one, and allow you to keep the conversation going.
I do indeed. Thank you very much, Emily. We shall put the glasses on for this portion of the presentation so I can read. This first question is for you, Steve. It is from Georgie. Hi, Stephen. Thanks so much for your dedication to polar bears. You are an inspiration. You certainly are. I've heard of floating platforms as an option/replacement to sea ice to help polar bears continue hunting. Do you know anything about the viability of these ideas?
Yeah, I guess I could say I do. Probably 3 or 4 times a year, PBI will get a suggestion from somebody that, oh, why don't we just put some big sheets of styrofoam out there or something for polar bears to walk around on? And some of the proposals have been for really elaborate structures that might be put out there. But we have to realize that polar bears depend on the sea ice surface for catching their prey, but the undersurface of that ice is the source of the energy that ultimately feeds the polar bear. If you look at sea ice, the undersurface is kind of like a miniature mountain range with cracks and crevices and peaks and valleys. And it's in that little mountain range that all these microorganisms grow. And you start out with algae and fungi and things like that, and grow up to the next stage is shrimp-like creatures, and then small fish feed on those, and then seals feed on the fish. And so styrofoam wouldn't be able to replace that ecosystem for starters. A recent paper, one that I think is one of the most important papers of recent years, but got about the least amount of attention, is some of our colleagues who showed that 86% of the carbon that ends up in a polar bear's body actually starts from that epontic community, that under ice community. So the sea ice is the source of the energy and nutrients for the polar bear, not just a place for them to walk around. The other part of this answer is, imagine how much styrofoam you'd have to create. We've lost enough sea ice in the summertime now, about the same size as twice the area of Texas. So that's a heck of a lot of styrofoam. And imagine the greenhouse gas emissions that would be required to make that styrofoam and the mess that we'd have on the beaches. So it really isn't practical. We really need to look at, okay, how can we save the sea ice in order to save polar bears?
We've been talking obviously a lot about climate change and the impact on sea ice and that impact on polar bears. That's obviously their primary concern, but it isn't necessarily the only one. Alysa, here's one for you, and it's from Elizabeth. Is sea ice loss the only conservation concern for polar bears?
That's a great question. It's definitely the main conservation concern, but it's not the only conservation concern. Polar bears are going up against a whole heap of issues right now as our human population is getting larger and expanding into areas that we didn't used to be in as often. So things like increased shipping and oil drilling in the Arctic is a major threat to polar bears, especially to denning mothers. And the threat of an oil spill is a big issue that people are concerned about. Of course, we also have toxins that make their way up through the Arctic, even if they're produced in the south. So certain polar bear populations and production, where we do see things happening in Norwegian bears, for example, have higher levels of pollutants than Hudson Bay bears. Here where those pollutants were created. We do see polar bears being at risk of other issues, and one thing that polar bears are working on is the human bear conflict issue as well. As polar bears are spending more time on land and coming into contact with human communities more often and being more nutritionally stressed, we do expect to see there be more head-to-head conflicts between these two species, and usually the polar bears will lose out in the end. But of course, sometimes people do too. So we should be protecting both of us, both polar bears and people. The more polar bears we can keep.
I think we lost Alysa there, so maybe we'll let Steve jump in, and I'm sure she'll join us again in a moment.
Yeah, that was too bad. So Alysa touched on the bear-human conflict, which is a really important issue. And there's another important issue of interference with polar bear reproduction. So yes, we definitely need to halt the sea ice loss if we're going to save polar bears. If we don't do that, nothing else really matters. But assuming that we are going to do that, we are going to get our act together as a global society and do that, what we need to do is preserve as many bears as possible to be around when we stabilize the sea ice. And one way to do that is, as Alysa was just pointing out, is to minimize bear-human interactions. And a really important research project that PBI has going on now is looking at modern technologies that might provide an early warning system for Arctic communities that bears might be coming into But think about it. If it's dark, which it is for about half of the year in the Arctic, and the snow is blowing and you can't see very much, are you going to detect a bear visually that's coming in at like 2 in the morning? Well, probably not. And so is there a way that we can use modern technology like ground-based radar to detect these animals and keep them from being shot and keep them from injuring people? Another really important threat right now is the continuing expansion of oil and gas exploration and development in the Arctic. And a lot of this is occurring at the time of year that polar bears are in maternal dens. And so not only do we need to shift away from oil and gas as our main sources of energy, but we also need to avoid doing what developments might continue to be needed by society. We need to avoid these really vital areas where polar bears produce their cubs so that we can, in fact, maintain as many bears as possible into the future.
It's a constant feedback loop, isn't it? In that climate change, in a sense, makes the environment more hospitable in the Arctic to conduct certain industrial activities which actually contribute to climate change, and so it keeps on going.
Yeah.
Here's one. There's a sort of a follow-up from there. I'll put this one to Steve. From Jane. How can we in the USA help with this work, regardless of election outcomes? Environmental regulation, she says, seems to be going back in time with the climate change concern, including backing out of the Paris Agreement.
That's a really important question. And I'm not sure I really have the answer, because the United States, regardless of what many people might think, the United States has historically been the leader in environmental protections and the leader in actions that actually benefit the globe. You know, it was the initiative of the United States that resulted in the Montreal Protocol. And, you know, we need to be leading in this effort. I had hoped that when the current administration decided to try and pull out of the Paris Climate Accords of 2015, that we might see some other countries step in. But in point of fact, we haven't. So, you know, I think you know, right now, China is actually emitting more greenhouse gases than the US is. But if you look at the cumulative amount of greenhouse gases that have been contributed to our atmosphere, the US is still far and away the largest contributor. So it really should be up to us to be taking the lead. Now, if we don't, what can we do at the community levels that Alysa was talking about? There's a lot of state actions, county actions, municipal actions that have actually been having quite an impact. And so, you know, we might be able to have the smaller jurisdictions, the more local jurisdictions, with the community support, with individuals pushing for that community effort, actually lead that direction. But ideally, we would have the national policy actions and leadership.
I'm sort of following on from that. Leslie asks, what specific actions should we be asking our elected leaders to take? And I'll ask both of you this. We'll stick with Steve and then go to Alysa. You know, if you've got an opportunity, if you've got this election time, maybe you've got a candidate standing on your doorstep, you want to talk to them about climate change, what do we want to ask them?
So what we need is consolidated leadership. First of all, making it clear to the public that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, not just for polar bears, but for all of us, for our children and our grandchildren, for a future that we actually could recognize compared to our past. And that we need to have leaders that will say, look, we need to take action on this, just like we did with the Apollo program when we were getting ready to go to the moon. Think about that. Think about how everybody in the country was behind it. We had national leadership, we had congressional leadership, everybody was behind it from the top to the bottom, and we were able to go to the moon. And that's the kind of program that we really need now. You know, if we'd have been working on this diligently 30 years ago, it would have been a lot simpler. A lot of the individual actions that Alysa started talking about when she first was speaking this afternoon, those things, those what we now call low-hanging fruit, they really could have made a difference. But now we really need that policy leadership. And so, you know, what I would say if somebody comes to the door is, are you going to support national leadership that tells us what the information is and what the solutions are and how we need to get there?
And Alysa, I wanted to ask you much the same thing, because of course it's not just the United States problem, it is a global problem. What are, you know, following on from what Steve had to say, your thoughts about some of the demands we should be making of our representatives?
Absolutely. Well, very similar in Canada. I think that we need to push our elected officials to have more investment in sustainable jobs and renewable energy jobs. That can be a booming sector and benefit people and benefit the environment. I think there needs to be better communication from the government about the plan moving forward with renewable energies and moving away from these fossil fuels. And one thing that has worked in Canada is the carbon tax. So we do have a Canadian carbon tax, and I'm originally from British Columbia, where the carbon tax was implemented over 10 years ago now, and to a lot of success. It has helped reduce the number of emissions, and money's gone back into the pocket of the average citizen. And this helps allow people to tap into more of these community programs. People need access to the programs that are there. If somebody wants to use a different type of energy or to buy an electric car, it's not always that simple. So we need to help people access the programs that are there and expand the programs that are available to get us using more renewable energies.
This is
Kieran,
a really good question. Sorry, go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, to follow up on what Alysa said about British Columbia's carbon tax, you know, a couple of years ago, the Nobel Prize winner in economics won the Nobel Prize because of work that he did showing that a carbon tax could be the real answer to how we confront this problem. And so, you know, even at very high levels, that idea has resonated pretty well. And there are a number of politicians and ex-politicians in the US who have been pushing variations on that kind of a theme. And so I think that that is one of the real potential answers that we could be trying to implement.
We have two more questions in the queue, and they're terrific ones. Here's one for both of you. We've got Steve here, so we'll start with him. How do you keep hope in this work?
Yeah. Well, I think that my feeling of hope at this point is hope that we will actually act on the things that we already know we need to do. I'm not just going to sit back and say, oh man, I hope we can save polar bears. But the hope has to be related to tangible actions. We know what actions we need to take, and it is my hope, and I'm still fairly confident that we ultimately will get ourselves on a path to take those actions.
Alysa, how about you?
I think for me, my hope comes from the kids I talk to. A lot of my job is talking to students these days and seeing their creativity and their passion and just their absolute drive to make sure that the world is still a stable and healthy place for them. It keeps me going and gives me hope that we're gonna be able to do what we're setting out to do here.
Let's finish. We've got another great question here. Let's finish on a nice positive one. Again, we always like to finish on a nice upbeat one. We're here to talk about polar bears, and of course polar bears are creatures of the sea ice. So here's this great question: what does it feel like to stand on sea ice? And as a follow-up, have you ever fallen through it into the Arctic Ocean? Alysa, you first.
Sea ice is one of my favorite environments on Earth. It is crazy. You can feel it cracking and moving under you. It's so cold. It blows my mind that any animal makes a living on the sea ice. It's like being on another planet. I've luckily never fallen through, but holy smokes, the safety gear that we take when we're working on the sea ice would help you out, at least if you did fall through.
Steve, I mean, you've had many, many years working in this most hostile of environments. So what are your impressions of it?
Well, for starters, I have fallen through a few times. We can can get that off the board right away. And it really is cold when you get into that, sub-freezing water. But I guess one of the things to think about sea ice is compared to freshwater ice, sea ice is very plastic. So especially when it's thin, when it's thinner than 6 or 8 inches, you can actually see it waving with the currents that are flowing underneath it. And then if you get out and walk on ice that's 3 or 4 inches, if you're lucky, it'll support you. Sometimes it doesn't, and that explains why I've fallen through. But if it does support you, you can actually feel your feet kind of going, and it's almost like walking on a trampoline or something, where each step kind of gives a little bit and sends a wave out across the surface. It's really quite a remarkable surface to walk on. And when you see a bear walk on it, and they get onto that thin ice, they can walk on ice that's much thinner than ice that a human could walk on, because I guess they've spent a couple 100,000 years evolving how to do that.
I lied to you. I said that was the last question. We've had one more. And it's good. This actually goes back to the first question that you answered about the importance of sea ice. It's from Susan. We talk about the bears, but how are the seals doing?
That's an important question, and it's one that actually is probably even more difficult to answer than the one about how polar bears are doing. Because if you think about it, polar bears live in these really remote areas, difficult to get to, difficult to study, but at least they live on top of the ice. The ringed seals, that are the principal food of polar bears, probably spend 90% of their time under the ice, where they're invisible to us. They come up through the ice to breathe, but in the wintertime, the ice is covered by drifted snow, and so often the breathing holes are totally covered too. So there aren't any really good estimates of how many ringed seals we have globally or in different areas. And there aren't any good projections that I'm aware of how they might do into the future. But we do know that there are some threats out there that are similar to the threats that polar bears face. For one, as the sea ice is declining, we know that the seals are feeding on that undersurface of the sea ice. So like the polar bear, they are threatened by a declining sea ice habitat. Also, ringed seals in particular give birth on the surface of the ice in little caves that are below the surface of the drifted snow, but above the surface of the sea ice. And it's in those little caves that they give birth to their cubs, or their pups. And if there's not enough snow, the pups are exposed, and not only can polar bears more easily catch them, but foxes can catch them more easily. Ravens, gulls can get them. I mean, a whole variety of predators suddenly could become important. And so with the sea ice diminishing, with it freezing later in the year and melting earlier in the year, there's a shorter period of time for snow to collect on top of that ice. And so we anticipate there will be increasing frequency of years when there's not enough snow to adequately protect these birthing layers. So we can see that that's a looming threat on the horizon, but we haven't really, I'm not aware that seal biologists have really been able to quantify that yet.
Mm. So what we're going to do is we assume that the last question was the last question, and we're just doing 2 encores now is what's happening, because the questions are still coming in. They don't want you to go. So right now, this is the last one. This is for either of you, from Hovey. Any current thoughts about what I call the 20th population? Polar bears in zoos and aquariums under human care. Do either of you want to take that one? Alysa, perhaps.
Sure, I can start, and then I know Steve has more to add. Yeah, Polar Bears International does work with a variety of zoos and aquariums under our Arctic Ambassador Center network. And I should also say that a lot of the social science I spoke about earlier, we are working with social scientists that are coming under the heading of an aquarium network in the United States. So we do think that this is a very strong partnership. We bring polar bear zookeepers and other folks that work with polar bears in zoos across the world, really, but especially the United States, up to Churchill, Manitoba, as part of our Climate Alliance program to learn more about polar bears, about how to speak about climate change using these tools that are more effective that I spoke about earlier, and really giving these people the opportunity to be able to go back to their institution and spread this passion for polar bears and spread, again, tangible actions that people in their own communities can take. So that's kind of the human side of it. And as for the polar bear side as well, I know there is some very important research going on with zoo polar bears that very much supports and impacts wild polar bear conservation. We do work with, again, a few zoo partners to do some research in totally ethical ways that the polar bears often happily participate in before doing wild polar bear research. One thing we're doing right now, for example, is testing tags, GPS tags that can go on polar bears and just stick in their fur. Very non-invasive way to track polar bears, but we're testing it on zoo bears first to make sure it works in their fur and in the cold water before putting them out in the wild. So I think that zoo bears play a huge role in furthering the species. For a lot of folks, it'll be the only polar bear they might ever see in their life will be at their local zoo. So if we can make sure that that bear is either contributing to the health of wild polar bears, or at least contributing to people's desire to take action on behalf of polar bears, then we're happy to continue supporting our zoo partners.
Yes, Steve, I mean, some of the research that I'm aware of is, you know, encouraging polar bears in zoos to sort of walk on treadmills, for example. It's a great way to get a sense of understanding polar bear locomotion and energetics that we wouldn't have the opportunity to do in the wild. Isn't that correct?
That's right. Yeah, the research opportunities for bears in captivity are pretty significant. And when we're talking about things like polar bear energetics, which is really what the survival of polar bears is all about. How much energy can they get before they have to live off of that energy for perhaps up to several months? So I think there's a lot of real opportunities for research. I wanted to tag off of one of the last things Alysa said, though, and that is, if you think about zoos, 180 million people a year go into zoos in the United States. And these are everybody from grandparents to grandchildren, everybody in between, all political persuasions, many different, all different lifestyles and life backgrounds. There is a tremendous opportunity for polar bears that are in zoos under human care to be true ambassadors for their wild kin. If their messaging is correct, if these zoos and aquariums are providing the right information to that broad audience, there is a tremendous conservation benefit there. One thing I think that some people might have a misconception about is that maybe somehow we could have captive breeding programs and release polar bears into the wild, or maybe we can extract polar bear sperm and eggs and use artificial insemination or something like that. I think those things are probably not very realistic, considering the long period of parental guidance and parental care that's required for polar bears in the wild. A mother bear typically spends 2.5 years with her cubs before they're able to go out on their own. So that's probably not going to be a very likely outcome of having polar bears in zoos. But informing our understanding of polar bear energetics and things like that, and then providing this tremendous opportunity to pass information on to a very broad audience. I think those things really are important.
Thanks so much. You guys rock. If we can't spend this season on Buggy One together, I'm very happy to be able to spend some time with you guys virtually. Thank you so much. That really is the end of the questions, and I think we will hand it back to Emily to wrap things up.
Yes, thank you so much, Kieran. Or sorry, we have a staff member named Kieran. You're Kieran.
That's right.
Old habits dying hard. But thank you so much, Kieran, and thank you so much, Steve and Alysa, for this sharing this imperative conversation and including us in your process. And thank you to all of the viewers and all of the attendees that have taken time out of your Wednesday to listen in on this conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, this is the first of a new series of conservation happy hours. So we'll have a couple more happening throughout the fall. Our next one will be on Wednesday, November 11th. So please keep an eye out for an invitation to that. And in the meantime, we're so grateful to all of you. So thank you, and be well and be in touch.